Welcome to Moonlit Ink BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Prologue: The Taste of Iron and Betrayal. The stone was colder than the winter outside, but Jun Mistra could no longer feel the chill. He lay in the bowels of the imperial palace, the very place he had spent 3 years decorating with his family's gold. Now, the gold was gone, and the only color left was the blooming, visceral crimson spreading across his white silk tunic. "You really should have been more careful, Jun," a voice sighed, a melodic, smooth baritone that used to make Jun's heart race. Jun looked up, his vision blurring. Alexis Nobel stood over him, looking immaculate. There wasn't a single drop of blood on his polished boots, despite the fact that his saber was still dripping. Alexis wiped the blade with a handkerchief, a silk one Jun had embroidered for their first anniversary. "The Mistra accounts are dry," Alexis continued, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a murder. "The northern mines are signed over to my name. Your father is, well, he won't be waking up from his illness. You've served your purpose, my dear. Keeping you alive now is just a liability I can't afford." Jun tried to speak, but a wet, rattling sound was all that escaped his throat. He reached out, his fingers trembling, grasping at the air. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tear that handsome, false face off. 3 years of devotion. 3 years of defending Alexis against the villains of the court. 3 years of handing over his family's legacy piece by piece to a man who had never loved him. Alexis leaned down, his shadow falling over Jun like a shroud. He pressed a mock-sympathetic kiss to Jun's forehead. "Don't look at me like that. You were always so sentimental. It's what made you so easy to break." Alexis turned on his heel and walked away, the heavy iron door clanging shut behind him. The silence of the dungeon rushed back in, broken only by the steady drip-drop of Jun's life hitting the floor. The darkness was closing in, heavy and suffocating. "I was a fool," Jun thought, his heart stuttering in its final beats. "I gave him everything, and he used it to sharpen the knife he put in my throat." The regret was a physical weight, heavier than the approaching death. If he had only listened to the rumors. If he had only looked at the antagonist, Dean Sullivan, with eyes that weren't blinded by Alexis's lies. If he could go back, he wouldn't just leave Alexis, he would dismantle him. He would find the man everyone feared and give him the keys to the kingdom just to see Alexis burn. "Please," Jun's consciousness flickered like a dying candle. "If there is any justice, give me one more chance. I won't be a stepping stone. I'll be the grave." The last thing he felt was the agonizing heat of his own rage. Then, there was only the void. Chapter 1: The Wedding That Wasn't. The air in the room was too thick, smelling of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of a memory Jun couldn't shake. Jun Mistra bolted upright, a strangled gasp tearing from his throat. His hand flew to his neck, fingers frantically searching for the jagged tear of the blade, the hot rush of blood, the sticky finality of death. But there was only smooth, cool skin. No blood. No iron. He wasn't on the dungeon floor. He was in his bed at the Mistra estate, the silk sheets soft, the morning sun filtering through the crystalline windows of his youth. "Young master? You're awake early." The voice made Jun flinch. Martha, his childhood nanny, stood by the washbasin. She looked 5 years younger. Her eyes weren't yet clouded by the grief of his family's eventual ruin. What day is it?" Jun managed, his voice raspy. "It's the day of the engagement banquet, of course. Lord Alexis will be here within the hour to escort you to the palace. You must look your best. The Nobel family has invited half the kingdom to witness the formal signing. The engagement banquet. The day his soul was sold for a pittance." In his first life, Jun had been flattered by Alexis Nobel's attention. He had mistaken greed for passion and control for protection. He had walked into that ballroom a proud heir and left it a signed and sealed asset. A cold, clinical clarity washed over him. The panic died, replaced by a crystalline rage that felt like a sharpened diamond in his chest. He didn't have time to wonder how he was back. He only knew he wouldn't waste the breath he'd been re-given. "Martha," Jun said, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His feet hit the plush rug, solid, real. "Bring me the black doublet. The one with the silver embroidery." "But Master Jun, Lord Alexis requested you wear the white and gold to match his house colors." "I am a Mistra," Jun interrupted, his gaze snapping to hers with a sharp intensity that made the old woman freeze. "I do not dress to match a house that has yet to earn my presence. Bring the black." An hour later, the heavy oak doors of the drawing room swung open. Alexis Nobel strutted in, looking every bit the golden lion the capital adored. He was handsome in a way that felt manufactured, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, a practiced, dashing smile, and eyes that never quite settled on Jun's face, only on the jewelry he wore. "Jun, my love," Alexis chirped, reaching out to take Jun's hand. "You look different. Why aren't you in the white?" "No matter, we must hurry. The carriage is waiting, and my father is anxious to finalize the dowry papers before the feast begins." The dowry. That was all it ever was. Jun didn't take his hand. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the light, looking like a dark omen in his black silks. "I've been thinking, Alexis," Jun said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "About the honeymoon?" "We can discuss it on the way," Alexis said, his tone tinged with the slight impatience he usually reserved for servants. "No," Jun turned, his eyes locking onto Alexis's. For the first time, Jun saw the man for what he was, a hollow vessel of vanity. "I've been thinking about the Nobel accounts. And the way your father has been borrowing from the Border Defense Fund to maintain your lifestyle." Alexis's smile faltered. His eyes sharpened, the mask slipping just a fraction. "What nonsense are you talking about?" "Jun, don't be tedious. This is a big day for both of us." "It is a big day," Jun agreed. He walked toward the door, passing Alexis without a second glance. "But not for you." "Where are you going?" "The banquet is at the palace." Alexis called out, his voice rising in confusion and irritation. Jun stopped at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile he had learned from the ghosts in the dungeon. "I'm going to the ballroom to greet our guests," Jun said. "And then, I am going to tell them that the engagement is off. Don't bother following me to the carriage, Alexis. You're no longer invited to my life." He walked out, the click of his boots on the marble floor sounding like the countdown to an explosion. He had 3 years of history in his head and a kingdom to burn. Chapter 2, The Lion in the Shadows. The carriage ride to the northern border was a grueling 2-week descent into a world of permafrost and jagged stone. For Jun, every bump in the road was a reminder of the soft, pampered life he was stripping away like dead skin. He didn't bring a retinue. He didn't bring the Mistra crest. He arrived in the territory of the Black Lion, wearing thick furs and carrying a heavy leather satchel filled with maps that shouldn't exist and ledgers that had been lost for years. The Iron Boar Tavern was a structural miracle, held together by sheer stubbornness and frozen mud. Inside, the air was a thick soup of unwashed wool, cheap ale, and the low, rumbling tension of men who had been forgotten by their king. Jun spotted him immediately. Dean Sullivan sat in the furthest corner, a shadow among shadows. In the previous timeline, Jun had only seen him from a distance, a disgraced commander led to the executioner's block, his eyes full of a terrifying, silent dignity. Up close, Dean was a mountain of a man, his face scarred by a stray blade and eyes as cold as the tundra outside. Jun walked past the rowdy mercenaries and slid into the bench opposite the most feared man in the north. Dean didn't look up from his ale. "You're lost, little bird. The Silk Road is 300 miles south." "I'm exactly where I intended to be, Commander Sullivan," Jun said, his voice steady despite the way his heart hammered against his ribs. Dean's gaze snapped up. It was like being caught in the sights of a predator. I haven't been a commander in 2 years. I'm a traitor. A rebel. Depending on which royal decree you're reading. I prefer the decree that calls you the only man with the spine to stand against the Nobel family, Jun countered. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a rolled parchment, sliding it across the scarred wood of the table. Dean didn't touch it. Who sent you? Alexis? Is this a new game? Sending his jilted fiancé to play spy? The mention of Alexis made Jun's jaw tighten, a flash of pure, unfiltered loathing crossing his features. It was the only thing that made Dean's eyes flicker with genuine curiosity. That wasn't the look of a scorned lover, it was the look of a man who wanted to watch a city burn. Alexis Nobel thinks I am crying in a villa in the south, Jun said softly. He is wrong. Open the parchment, Dean. Dean unfurled it slowly. His expression remained a mask of stone, but his fingers twitched. It was a detailed logistical map of the imperial supply lines, routes that were changed only 6 months ago and were supposedly top secret. Where did you get this? Dean growled, his hand dropping to the hilt of the heavy broadsword leaning against the bench. I have my sources. I spent years in the Nobel inner circle. They tend to speak freely around pretty things they think have no brains, Jun lied smoothly. He couldn't tell the truth, that he remembered the supply raids from the future, so he let Dean believe he was simply a very observant, very vengeful spy. Jun leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. In 3 days, a shipment of grain will pass through the Black Pass ravine. It isn't grain. It's black powder and silver. If you take it, your men eat for a year and your cannons have enough teeth to bite the capital. If you don't, Alexis uses that silver to buy the mercenaries he needs to wipe you out. Dean stared at him, searching for a trap, a tremor, any sign of deceit. He found only a cold, burning ambition that mirrored his own. Why help me? Dean asked, his voice low and dangerous. You're a Mistra. You're the aristocracy we're trying to tear down. Because the aristocracy is a rotting corpse, and Alexis Nobel is the maggot feeding on it, Jun said, his eyes flashing. I don't want your gratitude, Dean. I want your alliance. You have the steel. I have the secrets. Together, we take the throne, and I get the satisfaction of watching Alexis realize he lost everything to the man he called a traitor and the man he thought he'd broken. Dean looked at the map, then back at Jun. A slow, predatory smirk tugged at the corner of his scarred mouth. He reached out, his large, calloused hand engulfing Jun's in a grip that felt like a promise. The Black Pass, you say? Dean murmured. If you're lying to me, Mistra, I'll drop you off the ravine myself. And if I'm right, Jun replied, not flinching from the giant's shadow, you'll start calling me strategist. Chapter 3, The Architect of Ruin. The wind howled through the Black Pass ravine like a wounded beast, carrying the scent of pine needles and impending snow. High above the narrow trail, perched on a jagged limestone shelf, Jun Mistra pulled his fur cloak tighter. His breath came in small, ghostly plumes. Beside him, Dean Sullivan was a statue of iron and shadow. The commander hadn't spoken for 3 hours. He sat with his massive broadsword driven into the frozen earth, his eyes fixed on the bend in the road where the grain shipment was supposed to appear. The sun is dipping, Dean said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Jun's chest. My scouts report nothing. If those wagons don't crest that hill in 20 minutes, Mistra, I'm going to assume you're a very pretty distraction sent to lead my men into an ambush. Jun didn't flinch. He remembered this day from his past life, not because he was here, but because he remembered Alexis bragging at a dinner party about how he had outsmarted the northern rebels by moving a massive shipment of black powder under their very noses on this exact date. They're late because the third wagon broke an axle at the crossing 2 miles back, Jun said coolly, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. They're using heavy iron-reinforced crates. The weight is too much for standard merchant wheels. Just wait. Dean turned his head slowly, his icy blue eyes searching Jun's face. You speak with a lot of certainty for someone who hasn't left this ridge in half a day. How do you know about an axle? I know the Nobel logistics officer, Jun lied, keeping his gaze forward. He's a meticulous man, but he's greedy. He would have overloaded the wagons to save on the transit tax. It's a habit of his. Silence reclaimed the ridge. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then, a faint creak echoed through the canyon. Then the rhythmic thud-thud of heavy hooves. 6 wagons, draped in unassuming burlap, rounded the bend. They were guarded by 20 men in nondescript leather armor, but Jun recognized the way they held their pikes. These weren't caravan guards, they were the Nobel Private Guard, elite soldiers disguised as sellswords. Dean's posture changed instantly. The lethargy of the weight evaporated, replaced by the terrifying tension of a predator. He raised a hand, signaling his men hidden in the crags. They look like grain haulers to me, Dean murmured, his hand closing around the hilt of his sword. Watch the tracks, Jun whispered. Look how deep the ruts are in the mud. Grain isn't that heavy, Commander. That's silver. And that's death. Dean let out a sharp, piercing whistle. The ambush was surgical. The northern rebels descended like an avalanche. Boulders tumbled from the heights, blocking the path, and before the Nobel guards could draw their swords, Dean was among them. Jun watched from above, his stomach churning at the violence but his mind focused on the prize. He saw Dean cleave through a guard's shield with a single, devastating blow. The commander moved with a brutal, efficient grace that made the knights of the capital look like children playing with sticks. Within minutes, it was over. Dean stood amidst the wreckage, his face splattered with a dark spray of crimson. He walked to the lead wagon and smashed the back of a crate with his pommel. A cascade of silver coins spilled out, followed by the heavy, pungent smell of high-grade black powder. Dean looked up at the ridge, his eyes finding Jun's. There was no more suspicion in his gaze, only a dark, newfound hunger. When Jun made his way down the slope, Dean was waiting for him by the silver. The commander reached out, grabbing Jun by the front of his furs and pulling him close. He smelled of cold air and iron. You were right down to the broken axle, Dean said, his voice thick with something Jun couldn't quite identify. Who are you, really? No mere noble heir has intelligence this precise. Jun looked up at him, refusing to tremble. I'm the man who is going to put you on the throne, Dean. Does it matter how I know, as long as the gold is in your hands and the blood is on theirs? Dean stared at him for a long beat, his thumb brushing, almost accidentally, against the line of Jun's jaw. No, he whispered. I suppose it doesn't. He released Jun and turned to his men. Load it up. We move before the scouts report back. And see to the strategist, he rides with me. Jun let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The first domino had fallen. Alexis was officially poorer, and the villain was officially his. Chapter 4, The First Domino Falls. The news of the Black Pass heist hit the capital like a physical blow. In the opulent drawing rooms of the Nobel estate, the air was no longer perfumed with lilies, it tasted of desperation. Jun watched the fallout from a distance, or rather, through the frantic letters and intercepted reports that Dean's spies brought to their mountain stronghold. Alexis was bleeding. Not physically, but where it hurt him most, in his ledger. The loss of the black powder and the silver had crippled his ability to pay the southern mercenaries he had been quietly hoarding. He's hosting a neutral gala, Jun said, looking up from a parchment as Dean entered the command tent. The commander was stripping off his practice armor, his damp skin glistening in the torchlight. He paused, a brow arched. A gala? After losing half his treasury? The man is either insane or posturing. Posturing, Jun corrected, his fingers tracing the gilded invitation he had procured through a former contact. He needs to show the other noble houses that he isn't weak. If they smell blood, they'll stop lending him gold. He's inviting me, Dean. Or rather, he's demanding my presence to discuss the terms of our reconciliation. Dean's face darkened, a low growl vibrating in his chest. He moved across the tent, his large frame looming over Jun. You aren't going. It's a trap. He'll lock you in a tower the moment you step foot in the city. I have to go, Jun said, standing his ground. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from Dean's scarred forearm before he pulled back. I need to show them that I am not hiding. And I need to plant the seeds for his final ruin. If I don't go, he looks like the victor who scared me off. If I go and humiliate him, he's finished. Dean stared at him for a long, silent beat. I'm coming with you. As what? A rebel general? Jun laughed softly. You'd be executed on sight. As your guard, Dean countered, his voice like grinding stone. I'll shave the beard, wear the Mistra livery, and keep my head down. But I am not letting you walk into that viper's nest alone. The gala was a sea of shimmering silk and false smiles. When Jun entered the ballroom, the music didn't stop, but the whispers did. He was a vision in midnight blue, his hair swept back, his expression one of icy, untouchable regalness. Behind him, a tall, silent guard in a high-collared Mistra uniform followed, his eyes scanning the room with a lethal intensity that made the surrounding knights instinctively move aside. Alexis was at the center of the room, a glass of wine in his hand and a frantic glint in his eyes. When he saw Jun, he pushed through the crowd, a performative smile plastered on his face. Jun! My darling, Alexis exclaimed, loud enough for the nearby duchesses to hear. I knew you'd come to your senses. This little tantrum of yours has gone on long enough. Come, let's go to the balcony and discuss when we shall announce the new wedding date. He reached for Jun's wrist, his grip tightening with a hidden, desperate aggression. Jun didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He simply looked down at Alexis's hand as if it were a particularly unsightly insect. A wedding date? Jun asked, his voice ringing clear and cold across the immediate circle. Alexis, I came here tonight out of pity. I heard about the unfortunate accident at Black Pass. I assumed you were calling me here to ask for a loan to cover the noble house's impending bankruptcy. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Alexis's face turned a mottled, ugly purple. How dare you, that is a private matter, and highly exaggerated. Is it? Jun tilted his head. Then perhaps you can explain why the Imperial Audit Office received an anonymous tip this morning regarding the missing grain funds from the southern border? The ones that were supposed to feed the king's garrison but somehow ended up in a certain duke's private gambling account? Alexis froze. The color drained from his lips. In his past life, Jun had helped Alexis hide those very papers. Now, he had sent them to the one auditor who couldn't be bought. You little snake, Alexis hissed, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. He lunged forward, his hand raising as if to strike Jun's face in a fit of pique. He never made it. Dean moved faster than a blink. He didn't draw a weapon, he simply stepped between them, his hand catching Alexis's wrist in a grip that sounded like dry wood snapping. Alexis let out a strangled yelp, his knees buckling under the sheer, mountain-like pressure of the guard's presence. The young master is leaving, Dean said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to shake the chandeliers. Jun turned, not spared a second glance for the man who had once been his whole world. He walked out of the ballroom, his head held high, the sound of Alexis's frantic excuses fading behind him. Once they reached the safety of the dark gardens, Dean finally let go of the lethal tension in his shoulders. He looked at Jun, who was shaking, not with fear, but with the sheer, adrenaline-soaked high of victory. You did it, Dean murmured. You broke his mask in front of everyone. It's only the beginning, Jun breathed, looking up at Dean. The moon caught the silver of Dean's eyes, and for a moment, the villain looked at Jun with a devotion that was more intoxicating than any wine. I told you, Jun whispered. I'm going to give you a kingdom. Chapter 5, Forbidden Foresight. The victory at the gala had been a spark, the resulting fire was consuming the kingdom. With the Nobel family's reputation in tatters and their treasury empty, the Northern Rebellion transformed from a localized nuisance into a tidal wave. Dean's camp was no longer a collection of tents and mud, it was a sprawling war machine. Men flocked to his banner, disillusioned soldiers, starving peasants, and minor lords who saw the writing on the wall. Inside the command tent, Jun was hunched over a topographical map of the capital's outskirts. He was marking the locations of hidden grain silos, stores that the crown kept secret for a total war scenario. In 2 days, the third moon of the month, the king will order the southern gates locked, Jun said, his finger tapping a specific point on the parchment. He wants to starve out the rioters in the slums. If we seize these 3 silos tonight, we can feed the city before the gates even close. We won't just be conquerors, we'll be saviors. Dean, who had been sharpening a dagger by the hearth, stopped. The rhythmic shink-shink of stone against steel died away. He stood and walked to the table, his shadow looming large over the map. The third moon, Dean repeated. His voice was unusually soft, devoid of its usual gravelly edge. How do you know the king's internal schedule for the gates, Jun? That's not Nobel logistics. That's a decree that hasn't even been signed yet. Jun's heart skipped. He kept his gaze fixed on the map, his hand trembling slightly as he held the charcoal. I told you. I have sources within the palace staff. Servants hear everything. Servants hear rumors, Dean countered. He stepped closer, invading Jun's space until the heat from his body was palpable. They don't hear the specific dates of military blockades weeks in advance. They didn't hear about the axle on the third wagon. And they certainly didn't know about the secret audit of the gambling accounts. Dean reached out, his large hand gently but firmly catching Jun's chin, tilting his face up. Dean's eyes weren't angry, they were searching, filled with a deep, unsettling intensity. Every move we've made has been perfect, Dean whispered. Too perfect. It's as if you've already seen the war end. As if you're reading from a book I haven't opened yet. Jun's breath hitched. He couldn't tell him. He couldn't say, I saw you die. I felt my own blood turn cold while Alexis laughed. I am living in the echoes of a nightmare. Does it matter? Jun asked, his voice barely a whisper. If the outcome is your victory and the Nobel's ruin, does the source of the light matter, as long as it leads us out of the dark? Dean's thumb traced the line of Jun's lower lip. The touch was electric, a stark contrast to the violence of the world outside the tent. It matters because I'm starting to wonder what the cost is for you, Dean murmured. You carry the weight of this war as if the ghosts are already nipping at your heels. I don't want a kingdom if the man who gave it to me is hollowed out by the secrets he's keeping. Jun leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering shut for a brief moment of vulnerability. I'm not hollow, Dean. For the first time, I'm full. I'm full of the future I'm stealing back. Before Dean could press further, a scout burst into the tent, breathless. Commander. Lord Strategist. A messenger from the capital. The king has declared martial law. Alexis Nobel has been appointed High Warden of the city. He's offering a bounty for the strategist's head. Double what he's offering for yours. Dean's hand dropped from Jun's face, his fingers curling into a white-knuckled fist. The tenderness vanished, replaced by a cold, protective fury. He wants a bounty? Dean growled, turning toward his armor. He'll have a siege instead. Gather the captains. We move tonight. We aren't just taking the silos, we're taking the road to the palace. As the scout hurried out, Jun looked back at the map. The lines of the future were blurring. In his past life, the siege had lasted months and ended in Dean's capture. Now, they were weeks ahead of schedule. Dean, Jun called out. The commander paused at the tent flap, looking back. Don't let him get close to you, Jun said, his voice thick with an old, remembered fear. Alexis is a coward, but a coward with a knife is still dangerous. Dean gave a sharp, wolfish grin. Let him come. I have something to fight for now that's worth more than a crown. Chapter 6, The Scratched Mask. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the northern camp. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that usually preceded a landslide. Jun sat at his small desk, the oil lamp flickering as he obsessively cross-referenced the guard rotations of the capital's inner sanctum. His eyes burned with exhaustion. In his first life, the Black Night had been the turning point. The night Dean Sullivan's camp had been decimated by a surprise raid of Imperial assassins, leading to his eventual capture. Jun had moved the camp 3 miles east of its original historical location to avoid the ambush, but the prickle at the back of his neck wouldn't subside. I changed the location, Jun whispered to himself, his quill hovering over the parchment. They shouldn't be able to find us. A sudden, sharp twang sliced through the silence. Jun didn't even have time to stand before the canvas of his tent ripped open. 3 figures, clad in the lightless charcoal silk of the Nobel shadow striders, tumbled inside. They didn't go for the maps. They didn't go for the gold. They went straight for Jun. The Lord Warden sends his regards, the lead assassin hissed, his blade coated in a dark, viscous paralytic. He said he'd rather see you dead than in another man's bed. Jun scrambled back, knocking over his chair. He reached for a small dagger he kept hidden, but he was a strategist, not a duelist. The lead assassin lunged, the cold steel of the blade inches from Jun's throat, a mirror of the death he had already suffered once before. The air in the tent didn't just move, it exploded. A massive, armored form collided with the assassin, throwing the killer across the tent with such force that the center pole groaned. Dean Sullivan stood between Jun and the killers, his broadsword unsheathed and glowing dull red in the dying lamplight. He wasn't wearing his formal armor, just his leather breeches and a tunic, but he looked more terrifying than any demon of folklore. You touched him, Dean said. His voice wasn't a growl anymore, it was a dead, hollow sound that chilled Jun to the marrow. The 2 remaining assassins moved with supernatural speed, their twin blades flickering like vipers. Dean didn't parry, he hunted. He stepped into the path of a blade, letting it graze his shoulder just so he could catch the assassin by the throat. With a sickening crack, he tossed the body aside like a broken doll. The lead assassin, recovering from the initial blow, threw a handful of blinding powder and lunged for Jun one last time, desperate to complete the contract. No! Jun cried out, shielding his face. He felt a massive, calloused hand grab his waist and yank him behind a wall of solid muscle. Dean had moved with a speed that defied his size. He caught the assassin's blade with his bare hand, the steel biting deep into his palm. He didn't even flinch. With his other hand, he drove his broadsword through the assassin's chest, pinning him to the earth through the floor of the tent. The silence returned, heavier than before, broken only by the wet, ragged breathing of the dying man. Dean didn't look at the bodies. He turned immediately to Jun, his bloody hand reaching out before he realized he was covered in gore and pulled it back. Are you hurt? Dean demanded, his eyes wide and wild, searching Jun's face for even a scratch. Jun! Answer me. I'm fine, Jun whispered, his voice trembling as he looked at Dean's bleeding hand. Dean, your hand, you caught the blade. I don't care about my hand, Dean roared, the villainous rage finally breaking through. He grabbed Jun by the shoulders, his grip tight but careful not to bruise. They were going to kill you. In my own camp. Because of him. The Lord Warden bounty had made it personal. Dean pulled Jun into a crushing embrace, burying his face in the crook of Jun's neck. Jun could feel the frantic beat of Dean's heart, a rhythm of pure, unadulterated terror at the thought of losing him. I'm here, Jun said, his hands finally finding purchase on Dean's broad back. I'm not going anywhere. He can't take me back, Dean. Not anymore. Dean pulled back just enough to look Jun in the eye. The cold commander was gone. In his place was a man who would burn the world to ash just to keep one person warm. "Tomorrow, we march on the capital," Dean promised, his voice a jagged vow. "I won't wait for a siege. I'm going to tear those walls down with my bare hands and bring you his head on a platter." Jun looked at the villain he had cultivated, his protector, his sword, and felt a dark, satisfying thrill. The timeline was shattered. Alexis Nobel had tried to kill a ghost, and in doing so, he had awakened a god of war. Chapter 7: The Siege of the Capital. The sky over the capital was no longer blue, it was a bruised, choking charcoal, choked by the smoke of the outer districts. The siege of the imperial city was supposed to last 6 months. Thanks to Jun, it took 6 hours. Jun stood atop a rolling siege tower, his hand white-knuckled on the wooden railing. Below him, the northern army moved like a dark tide, but they weren't crashing against the walls, they were flowing through them. The drainage grates in the west sector, Jun had told Dean the night before. Alexis reinforced the main gates, but he forgot the sewers. He always hated the smell. He never stepped foot near them. Now, those very sewers were vomiting out Dean's elite vanguard. The inner palace was a labyrinth of screaming servants and fleeing nobles. Jun moved through the corridors with a haunting familiarity. He knew which floorboards creaked, he knew which tapestries hid bolt holes. Behind him, Dean was a whirlwind of steel, his broadsword cleaving through any imperial guard foolish enough to stand their ground. Dean didn't look at the gold or the art, his eyes never left the back of Jun's head, guarding him with a feral, singular focus. They reached the great throne room. The massive gold-leafed doors were barred from the inside. "Step back," Dean commanded. Jun moved aside. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the palace, Dean drove his shoulder into the wood. Once. Twice. On the third strike, the hinges shrieked and gave way, the doors slamming open to reveal the hollow opulence of the Nobel regime. Alexis Nobel sat on the throne. He wasn't wearing his crown, it was clutched in his trembling hands. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and darting. When he saw Jun, a hysterical, jagged laugh escaped his throat. "You," Alexis spat, standing up. He looked pathetic, a spoiled child playing king while his world turned to ash. "I should have burned the Mistra estate to the ground while you were still in your cradle. You ruined everything. My prestige, my accounts, my kingdom. It was never yours, Alexis," Jun said, his voice echoing with the weight of 2 lifetimes. He walked forward, stepping over the threshold. "You didn't build this. You bled it. You bled the people, you bled the North, and you bled me." Alexis drew a small, ornamental dagger, the same one he had used in the dungeon in the first timeline. He lunged at Jun, a desperate, clumsy strike born of madness. He didn't get within 5 feet. Dean was there in a blur, his massive hand catching Alexis by the throat and lifting him off the marble floor. The golden lion kicked his legs, gasping for air, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. Dean's grip tightened, the muscles in his arm corded like iron cables. "Wait," Jun said softly. Dean paused, his eyes glowing with a murderous heat, but he obeyed. He lowered Alexis just enough for the man's toes to touch the ground, though he didn't let go of his throat. Jun walked up to his ex-fiancé. He leaned in, whispering into Alexis's ear so Dean wouldn't hear the impossible truth. "Do you remember the dungeon, Alexis?" Jun murmured. "The cold stone? The way you wiped your blade on my handkerchief?" Alexis's eyes widened to the point of tearing. He choked, a sound of pure, primal confusion. "I remember," Jun whispered, his voice as cold as the grave. "And today, I am the one who isn't necessary. You are stripped of your title. Your family name is struck from the records. You will spend the rest of your life in the very hole you meant for me." Jun looked at Dean and nodded. Dean didn't kill him, that would be too quick. Instead, he threw Alexis toward the waiting rebels like a piece of refuse. Take him to the black cell. If he tries to speak, remove his tongue. As the guards dragged a screaming, sobbing Alexis away, the throne room fell into a heavy, ringing silence. The war was over. The villain had won. Dean turned to Jun, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked at the throne, then back at the man who had guided him to it. He didn't sit on the gold chair. Instead, he walked to Jun and took his hand, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the blood on his knuckles. It's done, Dean said. The city is ours. Are you satisfied, strategist? Jun looked at the empty throne, then at the man holding his hand, the man who was supposed to be his enemy, but had become his sanctuary. Not yet, Jun replied, a genuine, soft smile finally breaking through his mask. Now, we have to build something worth keeping. Chapter 8, A New Dynasty. The transition of power was not marked by the expected slaughter. Instead, it was marked by a quiet, methodical dismantling of the old world. 3 months had passed since the fall of the Nobel regime. The capital had begun to breathe again. The smell of smoke had been replaced by the scent of fresh mortar and the frantic, hopeful chatter of the marketplace. Jun Mistra sat in the high-backed chair of the Royal Library, his lap covered in ledgers, not of war, but of reconstruction. The heavy oak doors creaked open. He didn't need to look up to know the gate, the heavy, rhythmic thrum of boots belonged to only one man. You're hiding again, Dean Sullivan said. He looked different. The scars were still there, but the hollow, haunted look of the traitor had been smoothed over by the weight of a crown he hadn't wanted but wore with a terrifying competence. He had traded his furs for a high-collared black tunic, the silver lion of the north pinned to his chest. I'm not hiding, Jun said, finally closing the book. I'm ensuring the southern provinces have enough seed for the spring. If we don't fix the trade routes Alexis sabotaged, the coronation will be a feast of empty plates. Dean walked behind him, his large, calloused hands resting on Jun's shoulders. The heat of him was a grounding force, a reminder that the cold dungeon of the first life was truly, finally gone. The coronation is tomorrow, Dean murmured, his voice dropping an octave. The people are calling for the Iron King. But the council, they are calling for the Shadow King as well. They know who really held the maps, Jun. Jun leaned his head back against Dean's chest. I have no interest in a crown, Dean. I've had my fill of the spotlight. I prefer the shadows where I can see clearly. And I prefer the man who stands in them, Dean countered. He turned Jun's chair around, dropping to one knee so they were eye to eye. It was a position of suppleness that a king should never take, yet Dean did it without hesitation. In every story told of this rebellion, they say I am the villain who took the throne. Let them. But I will not rule this kingdom as a solitary monster. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It wasn't the gaudy, diamond-encrusted band Alexis had once forced onto Jun's finger. This was a simple band of dark northern iron, inlaid with a single, glowing piece of lapis lazuli, the color of the Mistra family crest. I didn't just take the city for the north, Dean said, his gaze unwavering. I took it so you would never have to run again. Stay with me. Not as a strategist. Not as a secret. As my equal. Jun felt a lump form in his throat. In his first life, he had died unloved and unremembered, a footnote in a greedy man's rise. Now, the most powerful man in the empire was kneeling at his feet, offering him the one thing he never thought he'd have, a choice. The people might talk, Jun whispered, his fingers trembling as he reached for the ring. A king and his strategist. They'll say you're still a villain for taking a noble as your consort. Let them talk, Dean growled, sliding the iron band onto Jun's finger. It fit perfectly. If being with you makes me a villain, then I'll be the most devoted villain this world has ever seen. Jun pulled Dean up, his arms winding around the king's neck. For the first time since he had woken up in his past self's bed, the tension left his body. The regression wasn't just a weapon for revenge anymore, it was the prologue to a life he actually wanted to live. The next morning, as the sun rose over a new era, two figures stood on the palace balcony. They didn't look like a hero and a victim. They looked like two architects of a new world, standing side by side. Alexis Nobel was a memory rotting in a cell. Dean Sullivan was a king. And Jun Mistra? Jun Mistra was finally, beautifully, free.